On today's World Insight, U.S. political showdown over a vacant seat in the Supreme Court after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the significance of the timing of her replacement. And in today's Pathfinder series, up close with Michael Pettis, an American finance professor and indie record label owner in Beijing. He shares what makes him optimistic and skeptical in China the past 2 decades.
There were so many great bands popping up all over China.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg leaves behind a legacy and a toss-up over her vacant seat. Her death has set up a heated political battle over who should pick her replacement and when. All because the presidential election is so close. President Donald Trump hailed the late justice as a titan of the law. He also announced a list of 20 potential nominees, including 3 sitting senators. Some law experts are worried Ginsburg's passing could dramatically alter the balance of the court, with conservatives having a possible 6-3 majority. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Senate will vote on a replacement even with the presidential election coming up. But Democratic standard-bearer Joe Biden said her replacement should not be nominated until after the presidential election in November. For more on the latest development in Washington, we are joined by Bruce Fein, constitutional lawyer, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. In Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, a professor of political science with the University of Iowa. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Of course, the world has been sad upon the news of the pass away of RBG, certainly a historic figure, particularly in terms of her contribution to the gender equity in the justice system. But Mr. Fein, I know you personally interacted with her throughout your career.
Yes, I had occasion to lunch with her intermittently when she was on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. She often had foreign jurists come and join us from Malaysia, Singapore, elsewhere. She was very eclectic in her intellectual interest. When she was a Supreme Court Justice, I visited her chambers from time to time with female lawyers who were eager to be inspired by her example. She was completely unpretentious, unfailingly courteous, a wonderful listener. She wasn't a school marm in her attitude, eager to laugh. She wouldn't take herself too seriously, but a very diligent and careful writer. I think her career, even antedating the U.S. Supreme Court, was quite storied. She virtually single-handedly argued cases in the Supreme Court, beginning with a case called Reed versus Reed in 1971, that elevated the status of women to a very rigorous category of suspicion on gender discrimination cases, that virtually made the Equal Rights Amendment superfluous. So she surely lived a career that every woman should admire and adulate and seek to emulate.
There's also a lot of admiration from this part of the world in China. If you look at the social media, for example, WeChat moments, a lot of people over the days have been talking about her stories and trying to get inspirations as a result. Professor Hagel, but it's also political, isn't it? Particularly leading up to the presidential election. The choice of a new Supreme Court justice couldn't be more political.
Unfortunately, that's true, and it's a bygone era of the times when Justice Ginsburg herself was confirmed to the Supreme Court by an overwhelming majority, and her ideological opposite, Justice Scalia, who died previously, and they were good friends, also was confirmed to the court overwhelmingly. And it's too bad that these days the politics plays such an important role, but on the other hand, we also know that the Supreme Court is very important in deciding a lot of issues that are hot-button issues before the court these days, and the politics makes a difference. And so it's unfortunate that almost immediately upon her death, people started playing the political game.
The reason why people pay so much attention to her is not only because of her achievements, but also because she is one of the crucial members among the 9 so-called the Supreme Court justices at critical point in terms of where ideologically or politically the Supreme Court likely to tend to be in the near future. Mr. Hagel, upon that, what do you make of the current debate already beginning among the Republicans and also certainly between the Republicans and the Democrats about the nominee?
Well, it's hard to say what's going to happen. There are certainly arguments that President Trump shouldn't nominate someone. When Justice Scalia died, there were similar arguments from the other side that Obama shouldn't appoint someone to replace him because it's an election year. But on the other hand, the president, regardless of whether it's an election year or not, has the authority to appoint someone. Then the question is whether the Senate's going to take up that nomination and have a vote on it. It's not entirely surprising that if the Senate is controlled by the same party as the president, they would be more inclined to do so. But if they are controlled by the opposite party, they would be less inclined to do so. And that's sort of where we're at now. And everything else is more or less political gamesmanship.
Mr. Fain, so far we have been hearing from news coming from your country suggesting 2 Republican female senators have been speaking out, and yet we do not know. There's at least a 4 needed in the Republican Party to vote against before the putting down of a nomination. So, Mr. Fain.
You're correct. Right now, the Republican majority is 53 to 47, and because under the Constitution, if there's a 50-50 tie in the Senate, the Vice President casts the deciding vote, and that would be Mike Pence, who clearly would vote to confirm any nominee of Mr. Trump. Now, we have Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who have said rather firmly they will not vote on a successor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg before Election Day, November 3rd. There are at least 2 other candidates who might join their ranks, Mike Lee and Mitch Romney of Utah. Their seats are not vulnerable. Mitch Romney, you may recall, voted in favor of one article of impeachment against Mr. Trump and incurred Mr. Trump's wrath, so he really doesn't have much to worry about in terms of his relations with Mr. Trump if he decided he would not vote to favor a confirmation vote before November 3rd. So Mr. McConnell clearly could lose 4 votes and have this stymied. Now, the closest historical analogy to what we have now is what we call the Midnight Judges Act of 1801. In 1800, there was a overwhelming victory of the Democratic Republicans by Thomas Jefferson over John Adams, and the Federalist Party wanted to pack the judiciary to cling to power, at least in one branch of government, in the lame duck session. It passed a Judgeship Act creating 16 circuit judges, but it so evoked the wrath of the American people that the act was soon repealed. All 16 judgeships were abolished. The Supreme Court upheld the abolition, and the Federalist Party disappeared. There was a similar but not exact analogy in 1937 when Franklin Roosevelt wanted to pack the court by creating 6 new vacancies who he would fill with his New Dealer loyalists. The American people again turned against Franklin Roosevelt, and I think the Republicans are risking a repeat of those 2 historical incidents if they try to rush a nomination before there's a vote in November 3rd, especially since the Republicans basically took the same position in 2016 with Merrick Garland.
I see. Professor Hagel, about politics, if President Trump and also the majority leader of the Republican Party keep on pressuring on having a new nominee, whether there's going to be political backlash or not.
Even though they have the right to nominate someone and bring it up on the Senate and perhaps vote one way or the other, it's basically the political game that has to be played here. And if they do it before the election, will it cost a number of senators? There are a number of senators that are in vulnerable seats that are running for re-election, including a few that are on the Judiciary Committee. And so there's some question about whether they would feel comfortable in having that vote, even to the extent that they would be willing to support Trump's nominee, assuming he nominates someone. Would that hurt them politically? Would they lose the election? Would that mean that the Democrats then get a majority in the Senate? There are a lot of considerations here. And again, even to the extent that we saw some of this happen with Scalia's death and replacement, we're much closer to the election this time, so that sort of brings that particular factor much more to the fore than had been previously the case.
Of course, a lot of things are, at this point, fluid, as we say. They are still changing minute by minute. Yet, there is an issue that is fundamental. How are we going to see the current realities of the division of labor among the government branches, namely the White House and also the Capitol Hill and also, of course, the Supreme Court, which are important pillars of the U.S. political system? What might be the debate and leading up to the nominee, to the election, have an impact on the current reality? Professor Hagel and then Mr. Fain.
Well, I think that is a conversation that we're having right now, that there are a number of people that are particularly unhappy with the potential of Trump nominating someone and the Republican Senate bringing it up and are basically threatening things like, as was mentioned, the court packing plan previously didn't go well then. Maybe it'll go better this time if it's tried by the Democrats. It's hard to say. On the other hand, what's going to happen even with the election? If all of this occurs before Election Day, will the voters be in favor of it? Will they be against it? And it's a little bit hard to say at this point. I think that certainly those on the left supporting Democrats will be even more energized, but they were pretty energized to start with. I think maybe what might happen if Trump were to do this is that it would give more energy to some of the Trump supporters that may have been drifting off because they were a little tired of Trump at this point, so forth. But bottom line is that it's going to be close either way. It's just a matter of how contentious it will all be.
Mr. Fain, your thoughts?
Well, I think the regrettable aspect about this particular controversy is that no matter what, it clearly indicates a diminishing of what we would typically call the independence of the Supreme Court. Obviously, the justices emerge from a political process, but it's never been like this where it's so clearly partisan in character. It matters of degree. Justice Ginsburg's vote made Chief Justice Roberts kind of a swing vote, where the court was not clearly bent extremely right or left. For instance, the court invalidated Mr. Trump's effort to nullify the so-called DACA program, letting hundreds of thousands of children of undocumented aliens remain in the United States. It was even his own appointee, Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the opinion holding that transgender individuals were protected against gender discrimination under the civil rights laws. But I think the replacement of Justice Ginsburg by someone who, and if you look at the list, all would be thrown into a crowd of clear, sharp, partisan conservatism, would imbalance the court and result in legal doctrines that would create rather than suppress the more contentious part of our social divisions.
What do you think, Mr. Fain, are some of the signs to watch? What are some of the most important timings and steps to watch in order to have a better understanding to the question of we just discussed, leading up to the nominee of the candidate?
Well, the first will be the actual nomination itself. President Trump has stated, one, the nominee will be a woman. Number two, he stated it will be forthcoming this week. Now, there's, it's clearly just barely over a month and a few days before November 3rd. Now, typically what would happen, as I was involved in Supreme Court appointments when I was at the Justice Department, background investigations run by the FBI, and there would be a considerable time that would elapse between the naming of a nominee and the actual hearings that oftentimes lasted several days before a committee vote. So the speed with which Senator McConnell tries to accelerate the hearings will be key to examine whether it's feasible to even have a sensible vote where we've had a complete airing of the nominees' views and positions for the American people to see on TV, for it to be digested, a committee vote, and then going to the floor to consider whether it's going to look like they're cutting corners to ram this through before Election Day, which I think will clearly hurt the Republican Party. The American people do not want the judiciary to be a political football. That's been made clear throughout history.
So the nominee, which is to you the most important step, of course, the timing of it. And Professor Hagel.
Well, one thing to follow up on that is that because President Trump has released his list of potential nominees beforehand, a certain amount of work in terms of that background vetting has already taken place, I'm sure. Now, it will certainly intensify, but once, and even well before the death of Justice Ginsburg, that people were digging into that, both people that maybe were for the various people very against the various nominees, were looking to find information and either to support or oppose those people. So I'm not sure that it has to take that much time. Perhaps the closest appointment before an election day happened in 1956 when Justice Sherman Minton, had given President Eisenhower notice in early September that he was going to retire, and President Eisenhower appointed William Brennan to the Supreme Court on October 15th of 1956, so only a couple of weeks before the election. So, and it was a recess appointment, though, so they didn't go through the full process at that time, but nevertheless, it was very quick.
If I could just add that in terms of the background, it's not just, interest groups that examine the writings and whatever from newspapers and the public domain. The FBI has to conduct background investigation too. You may recall in the Brett Kavanaugh case, there was at least some protest that the FBI hadn't been given enough time to investigate certain of the allegations. And no, the FBI doesn't begin background investigation before a nominee is named. They don't have enough resources. It's way too costly. That process has not begun and will not begin until a name is actually submitted.
Remember last time, the nominee given by the president, in fact, has created such a stir. Of course, he eventually becomes a Supreme Court justice, but with a strenuous effort and uphill battle, quote unquote, by the White House and the majority leader. So if this time another one, will this be similar in terms of the efforts, or probably even more? Your personal judgment, Mr. Fain.
Now, I think this one will be very contentious. I believe if he nominates Amy Barrett, which she now sits on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, in Illinois, I think that will be very contentious because of her views on freedom of religion. That always spurs divisiveness, if you will. Some statements seem rather extreme, and her writings on the court. And I do believe this could turn into a very combustible confirmation hearing, given the fact that religion has emerged as what you might call a wedge issue between Republicans and Democrats in the past many elections.
Professor Hagel?
Yeah, I agree that certainly Judge Barrett had a lot of opposition even when she was being appointed to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And so that's certainly something that Democrats would point to oppose her. But to a certain extent, it really doesn't matter who it is that Trump's going to appoint, that the left will be extremely unhappy with anybody that Trump appoints and will do whatever is necessary. And we've seen this, well, at least on social media, where a number of Democrats have basically said that they will oppose any Trump nominee with every means at their disposal.
I see. Before we go, I do want to lead the question to a similar direction, yet a bit different. That is going to be the relationship between the Supreme Court and the president. And yet we have seen the president setting a precedence of emphasizing executive orders rather than going through, quote unquote, the system. So what does that mean for future relationship? I mean, even right now, the relationship between the White House and the overall, quote unquote, system. With this precedence, what's likely to be the follow-up for the next president, be it Trump or Biden? Mr. Fain.
Well, presidents have increasingly resorted to executive orders to evade what they call is congressional gridlock, which is really just a pejorative for checks and balances at work. President Obama did it. President Trump even did it more, but it didn't begin on their watches. It's important to remember that one of Mr. Trump's executive orders, the one that atop to repeal, if you will, an executive order, a memorandum of President Obama relating to the DACA children, was held illegal by the U.S. Supreme Court, in an opinion by Chief Justice Roberts. So the court, I think, traditionally plays a checking role on executive excesses, but it's just a checking role. In the long run, the Supreme Court has never blocked over a substantial period, you know, the power of the executive and the congressional branches. And I believe that the greatest danger that we confront is the fact that the court gets involved too little, because Congress basically has surrendered its checking power over the president. They virtually no longer enforce subpoenas with serious sanctions, which they could undertake without going to court and waiting several years. And I believe that it's unfortunate that the Supreme Court simply does not and will not play the role that's necessary because of Congress's shortcomings to block executive overreach.
Mm-hmm. Professor Hagel.
Yeah, I would agree with that in the sense that, at least in the sense that the Supreme Court, even if somebody is ideologically in tune with a particular president, that doesn't necessarily mean that the court's going to go along with that president in all instances. Mm-hmm. That there is an independence to the Supreme Court that's still there. Now the question is how involved they want to be. If you tend to be more conservative, and if the majority in the court's more conservative, they may be more hands-off in terms of judicial restraint, not wanting to get involved, let the political branches sort it out. But on the other hand, if at some point there's a more liberal president, if Biden wins, or if the balance in the court shifts the other way, they may be more willing to allow the president to do whatever he or perhaps she wants at a particular time. So both the presidency switches back and forth ideologically, but the court does too, although often at a much slower pace.
Timothy Hagel, Bruce Fain, I learned a lot. Thank you so much for your insights.